Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we are going to be talking about early sport specialization, and I'll define that for you and explain what it is in a second. This was a topic that came up in the summer when I was teaching this Savvy Dance Teacher course. So that is my course that I teach. It's a 2-day in-person course, and it's all about applied dance science. So it covers a huge range of topics. We look at things like incorporating dance science into dance schedules. So periodization, rest and recovery. We look at functional movement assessments. We look at strength and conditioning, all sorts of different topics. So it's a 2-day dance science course for dance teachers. And during that course, we do spend a lot of time talking about things that you've heard me talk about on this podcast before, like periodization and the need for off seasons and cross training and how we incorporate cross training into dance schedules and all of that kind of stuff. And during those conversations, the topic of early sport specialization came up, and a few of the teachers had questions about it. And I realized I've actually never done a podcast episode about it before. And for some reason, I think in my head, I thought I had done one, but anyway, I have not. So today is the day when we are going to dive all into all things early sport specialization. So I'm going to continue to use that term, even though I know we're talking about dancers, because in the research, that's sort of what it's termed or what it's called, or you'll even see it referred to as ESS. But obviously, we can extrapolate some of that information to the dance population. So although I will continue to refer to it as early sports specialization, we could also talk about it in the lens of early dance specialization. And I will relate this back to dance, but I just want to give you a background of what this even is. What is it that we're even talking about? So there are a few different definitions of what this is. And when you look at the research on early sport specialization, the research isn't always fantastic. And part of that is that there was not or is not a definition that is consistently used across the board. So there are definitions that are sort of kind of consistent, but when you're looking at some of the research, you do want to make sure, or at least look at, what definition are they using for it? How are they defining it? And there have been some consensus statements on this. So the definition that is probably most commonly used, or the one that you will see that's sort of been endorsed by some of the big international associations and things like that, is early sports specialization being defined as intensive training or competition in an organized sport before the age of 12 for more than 8 months of the year, with focus on a single sport to the exclusion of other sports. I will read that again and break that down a little bit. So it's intensive training or competition. So I'm not talking about our recreational dancers in this sense. These are our dancers who are in more pre-professional programs or competitive programs. So intensive training or competition in organized sport. So in this case, it's dance. Before the age of 12, a lot of the studies actually just refer to before puberty. And obviously that happens in different athletes and different dancers at different ages. So 12 is not a hard and fast kind of like deadline necessarily, but we're talking about before puberty hits. And so it's going to be different in male and females potentially. So before the age of 12 for more than 8 months of the year, with focus on a single sport, so in this case, focus on dance, to the exclusion of other sports. So meaning that you're not also then participating in other sports. So that is the definition of early sport specialization that we are sort of working with. Some of the definitions will talk about it being year-round training, but this definition is talking about it being intensive training for more than 8 months of the year. And most of our dancers and our competitive dancers fall into this category of early sport specialization, if we're thinking about that from an 8 months of the year perspective. This idea of early sport specialization has gained a lot more popularity or traction, or it's just more prevalent in recent years. If we look at generations prior, it was much less common for kids to participate in only one sport. It was much more common for kids to participate in sports seasonally. So maybe we had a kid who did, I don't know, we'll just use common sports, played soccer in the fall, and then maybe played basketball in the winter, and then they played baseball in the spring/summer. And so they played 3 different sports competitively. They were probably doing sports year round, but the sports had defined seasons, and the seasons didn't necessarily overlap very much, and kids could participate at a competitive level in a variety of sports. That has started to really change in recent years, where more and more sports are starting to run year-round, and therefore it is much, much harder for athletes or dancers to participate in multiple activities at the same time, or at least at a competitive level. A lot of this started to change, I think, and a lot of the research kind of points to this. There was research going on based on this concept of deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is the idea that if you're doing focused practice in one specific area or skill set or what have you, you were going to be able to gain mastery of that skill in a defined length of time. And so there was a researcher named Erickson who published some stuff, I think it was in the late 90s, around this idea of 10 years of kind of like training or deliberate practice, we'll call it, or that idea of 10,000 hours. And so Erickson was the one who first kind of like coined that or started looking at it in the field of deliberate practice, but it became more widespread in terms of knowledge, or popular, or whatever you want to call it, when it was discussed in, I believe it was a Malcolm Gladwell book, and I can't remember which one of his books it was, but that idea was discussed and became kind of popularized, and it became something that a lot of people became familiar with, the concept of this 10,000 hours or 10 years of deliberate practice. And that was how you can sort of gain mastery in a particular skill. And that information was sort of taken by the sports world, and especially when we're looking at like youth training, and sort of was applied to that setting. Interestingly, the original research wasn't done in athletes. The original research, and I actually haven't read the original research paper, so I might not get this 100% right, but I know some of the original research, and it might not have been Erickson's study, but some of this original deliberate practice was actually done in musicians. And so then people were like, well, if that's the case, they sort of extrapolated and, started applying it to the sports world or more athletic populations. So I think that is one of the reasons why early specialization has become more prevalent in youth sports, was this idea of deliberate practice. So if we can start an athlete younger, so say at 6 years old or 8 years old, and have them focus on one sport. And there were athletes that also, not that they were purposely trying to popularize this, but you would hear stories of athletes like, say, Tiger Woods, who at a really, really young age was, training fairly intensively in his sport. And so there's all these stories about him as like a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old. And so people started to see that and say, okay, well, if I want my athlete to have the success that Tiger Woods had in his career, they need to also start at 3 years old, 4 years old, 6 years old. And so I think it's a bunch of those factors sort of combined really popularized this idea of early sport specialization. There's other things that also have contributed to that. There's been a big push for professionalization or more professionalism within youth sports. Youth sports has become big business. And so we can look at things like the Little League World Series or things like that have become really big commercial enterprises. And so there's money behind them, and there's sponsorship, and there's all of these like opportunities. And the kids playing in that are 12, 13 years old. Like, they are still children. And so in order for them to get to the level where they can be, playing in a Little League World Series, they've likely had to specialize in baseball by the time they are 7, 8, 9, like earlier on in their life. So definitely professionalization of youth sports. And like I said, youth sports is big business. So if you run a youth sport business, whether that is you are a coach, whether it's you run, camps like skills camps, training camps, you're putting on a tournament or things like that, there's money to be had in those businesses. And it's no different in the dance world. So obviously dance studios are businesses as well, but there's all the extra business around the edges of that. And so we have all of these master classes and conventions and private lesson opportunities and, even just like competitions and things that are these extra opportunities that dancers can participate in, which often then leads to the exclusion of other activities or other sports at the expense of being able to participate in these dance events. Some of that kind of drive for that, let's say, or let's just call it drive, it comes a bit from pressure on youth athletes. So if we actually talk to youth athletes, they don't necessarily want to specialize in a single sport at a young age. Some do, but it is pressure that is coming from either the parent or from the coach or from these sport businesses to say, we want you to focus on one thing. And from a business perspective, it is more lucrative for that business if that athlete is investing more time and more dollars in that business. So although this idea didn't probably stem from a business perspective, it definitely came out of that idea of deliberate practice and trying to, accumulate those 10,000 hours of deliberate practice in order to gain skill or gain mastery at an activity. There is definitely an upside for businesses when we have youth athletes who are really specializing in one particular area. And we need to keep that in mind because that is used as a marketing tactic. And so a lot of parents have felt a lot of pressure to have their children specialize early because they're told that if your child does not specialize early, they're going to fall behind. They're going to lose out on those opportunities. If they don't go to these extra training camps, they're not going to get picked for the select travel team or whatever the scenario is. There's a lot of pressure that parents feel to make sure that their kid isn't missing out or that their kid is not falling behind. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why early sports specialization has become more common in sort of the last, let's say from the late 90s or early 2000s up until now. But early sports specialization is ultimately fairly problematic. And so there's been research looking at what are the effects and what have the outcomes been of this early sports specialization on our youth athletes or our youth dancers in this case. And there's three main areas that we are most concerned about when we think about the potential concerns with early sports specialization. So the first one is injury rates. The second one is psychological impacts of it. And the third one is burnout or dropout of these youth. And I'll dive into all three of these because all of them are worth kind of paying attention to. So we're going to talk about injuries first. So we know from research, and this, again, there's not a lot of dance-specific research, but most of this research just comes from studies that have looked at a variety of sports. So most of the research or a lot of the reviews have looked at, kids playing all sorts of different sports, not necessarily that it was only, conducted on, say, soccer players. There's reviews and stuff that have looked at kids that specialize in soccer early versus kids that specialize in tennis early versus kids that specialize in cycling early, whatever it is. So there's lots and lots of research that has been done by this. And we know that kids who specialize in sport earlier are at increased risk of injury. And part of that has to just do with overuse type injuries. The rate of overuse injuries is much higher in early specialization than it is in later specializing athletes. And that makes perfect sense. If you're only participating in one sport, or in our case, we're participating in dance, you're using the same muscle groups in the same movement patterns over and over and over again. And we're not necessarily developing other muscle groups or other movement patterns. And we've talked about this before on podcast episodes where we've talked about the importance of cross-training and things like that. And the same holds true. So if we think about a youth athlete participating in multiple sports, those sports almost act as cross-training for each other because they have different movement patterns. So we see higher rates of injury in single sport versus multi-sport athletes. And the numbers vary, but a lot of studies kind of point to potentially a doubling of injury rates in single sport versus multi-sport athletes. So there was one study that looked at lower extremity injuries in particular. And again, this was not in dancers, but we know that lower extremity injuries are the most common injuries in dancers. So this study looked at lower extremity injuries, and athletes who participated in a single sport, so they specialized early, had a 46% injury rate versus athletes who were multi-sport athletes who had a 23% injury rate. So that injury rate in a multi-sport athlete was almost half of the single sport athlete in this one particular study. There are lots of studies that show the same thing in terms of not necessarily those exact numbers, but single sport athletes are at higher risk for injury than a multi-sport athlete is. Not only are we concerned about overuse injuries in those single sport or early specialization athletes, but we're also concerned, especially because these athletes are skeletally immature, we're concerned about their bone and joint health and development. And so again, if we have kids who are participating in primarily one activity or one sport, we may be putting undue stress on their bones and their joints that are still growing and still modeling and still forming. And we see this really commonly in baseball players. And so you'll see kind of issues that happen at either the shoulder or the elbow in throwing athletes, and especially in the kids who are pitching. And that is the reason why there are limits on the number of throws that an athlete is allowed to make. And they actually have pitch counts in Little League and for like youth baseball players. In dance, the thing that I would be most concerned about is hip joint and like hip health development in our dancers who are specializing early and only participating in sort of dance as their primary activity. Dance spends the majority of your time in a turned out position. So we have that like lateral rotation of our lower extremities. And over time, if we're constantly in those positions, what are we doing to the development of dancers' hip joints if they are specializing and participating in high levels of this early in life? And we don't have the answers to that, but it is something that I would be aware of and concerned about when we're thinking about injuries in these early sport specialization populations. So overuse injuries, certainly, but then also bone and joint health and development in these athletes. We also are concerned about the psychological toll that specializing early takes on these athletes. So there's been lots of studies kind of looking at this sort of stuff, and athletes who specialize early report more emotional exhaustion. They report more psychological fatigue, more psychological stress. There was a study done of rhythmic gymnasts, so again, not dancers, but it's at least an artistic sport, who looked at dancers who specialized earlier. So dancers who trained really intensely from the ages, I think this study included the dancers had specialized between the ages of 4 and 16. Sorry, that was an awkward way of saying that. They rated their health and their experience of fun. They had less fun than their counterparts who specialized later in the same sport. So again, we just need to be careful and aware of what type of stress are we putting on these young athletes or young dancers when they are specializing entirely in one sport or they're sort of consumed by one sport. Some of this psychological stress or distress that they might be reporting can certainly come from external pressures and things like that. Like we said, the athletes who specialize earlier are often pressured into doing it, whether that be by a coach or by a parent or whoever it is. And that is going to trickle down to that dancer or that athlete, and they are going to experience those psychological stressors as well. So we need to be really careful about how it is that we're influencing this athlete's participation in their sport, because things like that are probably modifiable. We can probably address some of those things. I'm going to talk about kind of solutions or like things we can address in a minute, but it's just something to consider that we know that single sport athletes or early specializing athletes have more or report more psychological stress or having less fun in the sport and things like that. And then the third thing, and this is maybe the one that I think doesn't get talked about enough or as much, but I think is maybe what we should be talking about the most, is these increased rates of dropout, or some of the studies reported as burnout. But there are huge numbers of youth athletes who end up quitting sports, and it depends on what age bracket you look at, what the stats are, but, quit sports by age 13 or by 14 or by 15. And a lot of that is linked to them being early specializing in that sport. And you can imagine that if you, specialized when you're, say, 6 or 7 or 8, and all you've done is play soccer or baseball or danced or whatever it is, by the time you're 13, 14, 15, maybe you're getting bored of that. And a lot of the athletes just report boredom, they report burnout, they report that they no longer enjoy playing the sport, and they end up quitting. And when they end up quitting, they don't have another sport to fall back on necessarily because they haven't participated in anything else. And that is a huge issue in my mind. And I think that we don't talk enough about the rates of youth dropout from sports and organized activities, and especially if you work in, say you're a dance teacher, so you're seeing the kids who stick with it and who participate. But when we actually look at population levels, that's a very small percentage of kids who continue to participate in sports or organized activity into their adolescent and teenage years. And we all know how many benefits there are to them. And that is not what this podcast is about today. But I think that these hugely high dropout rates, and they're higher for females than they are for male athletes as well, and that is also problematic. We should be talking about that more and be more aware of that. And the more diversity of sport and activity experience kids have younger in life, the more options they have when they're older. So even if they decide, you know what, soccer's not really for me anymore, but I actually still really love volleyball, so I'm going to play volleyball and continue to participate in that sport. It gives them those options and gives them things that they can stay attached to, so that they're not just quitting the one and only sport they've ever played, and then they're going to be more reluctant or more hesitant to try something that they don't have experience in and that they have not played in the past. So dropout or burnout, or however you want to phrase that, is definitely something that I think should be on people's radar more. And the more we kind of pressure kids earlier in life to pick a sport or to specialize or to focus on one sport, the more likely they are to drop out of those sports later in their adolescent years. So that is the third major concern. So all of these concerns together, so whether it's the injury rate, the psychological toll it takes, the dropout rates, those types of things, all of those are significant enough that several international consensus statements have been issued advising against early sports specialization. So it's like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Sport and Orthopedic Surgeons, and I think the IOC even has a consensus statement. Actually, maybe theirs is slightly different, I think. Anyway, whatever. There are all sorts of international bodies that have come together and issued consensus statements saying we do not believe that kids should specialize in sport early in life or like prior to puberty, that they should diversify their movement experiences and their athletic experiences prior to that. And then if they are going down the competitive track, that like after puberty, and so generally, sort of 13, 14, maybe 15 is when you may need to then hone in on one particular sport and focus on that sport if you do want to be competing at a high level in a particular sport. So that's just a little bit of background on what early sports specialization is and why it is, I'm going to say, problematic, and why we want to consider sort of diversifying our movement experiences that our young athletes are having. I was going to do this all in one podcast episode, but I'm realizing that this is going to turn into a long episode because I haven't even talked about the considerations for dance yet. So I think I'm going to wrap things up there, and I'm going to do a part 2. And this is totally on the fly. I was, like I said, totally planning on doing this as one podcast episode, but I think part 2 is necessary to talk about the specifics of dance and how we can actually work around this, or what we need to consider with dance and early sports specialization. So I'm going to wrap things up there. If you have any questions or want to discuss this further, please reach out, send me a message. I love to hear from you all. And thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and stay tuned for part 2.